Bonjour, good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the first ever in Ottawa Symposium dedicated to EU-Canada cooperation in common security and defense policy. I'm all the more delighted to welcome you to this event since it's been 4 years since I left my diplomatic posting in Ottawa. So it's a great pleasure to be back in this beautiful city. It's heartwarming to see many familiar faces in the audience, but I don't want to get too sentimental about it. So allow me to have the honor to call to the floor Her Excellency, Ambassador Marianne Konings, the head of delegation of the European Union to Canada. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Good morning, dear Parliamentary Secretary Bizan, Deputy Secretary General Majaj Popovsky, dear colleagues, ambassadors and members of the Diplomatic Corps, senators, members of Parliament, generals and admirals, and all the colleagues also who came specially from headquarters Brussels to join us, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you very much at participating at this very first, as was mentioned, Symposium on European Union-Canada cooperation in the field of common security and defense policy. It's indeed the first here in Canada, and I'm sure that it will be a start of a series of symposium. The main aim, I would say, is to raise awareness and visibility to what the common security and defense policy of what we call CSDP is, what it means, what its achievements it has, its potential and prospects of cooperation, particularly with our Canadian partners. I would say that this symposium is a very timely event for 3 reasons. It follows the conclusions of the European Council of December 2014. The European Councils, for those who don't know it, it's the meeting of heads of government and states of the European Union, and they only deal with extremely important issues. So they had a very important European Council in December, where the European leaders made a very strong commitment for the further development of a credible and effective common security and defense policy. It's also timely because of current developments in the world, and particularly current developments which are happening in our neighborhood. And given that exactly the objective of our common defense and security policy is to contribute to peace and stability in our neighborhood and in the world in general. And it's also timely, and I'm very pleased about this, because the European Union and Canada have a very strong strategic partnership, and I think that when we think about European Union-Canada relations, everybody thinks about trade in the first place, but it's much more richer than only trade and other parts of cooperation. I think that also in the field of common security and defense, we have a strong partner with Canada. This symposium, therefore, is aimed to have a dialogue between the European Union and Canada, with you all to compare policies, to compare practices, to compare experiences. And hence, this symposium will address the past, the present, future Canadian missions and military operations in other parts in the world than our own. And the European Union has currently 16 ongoing operations, like the fight against piracy of the Somali coast, and we will have really very high-level experts who have experienced it, who will talk about it, or in Mali, where we are training Malian soldiers. We are pleased that already we have a cooperation today with Canada. Canada participates in some of the European Union CSDP missions, and the aim of this mission is to act better and faster if we intervene together. And hence I'm very pleased that we can count today at this symposium on so many high-level experts from both sides with great expertise and concrete expertise in the field. This symposium will also address what we call the comprehensive approach of our common and security defense policy. Comprehensive approach because the European Union is very strong also in other policies like trade, development, justice, human rights, rule of law and good governance. And comprehensive means that we combining all these instruments that the European Union have also to ensure consistency in our policy. This symposium, as I said, is meant to further strengthen the cooperation between a strategic partner of the European Union, Canada, and the European Union. But it's also, this symposium will also address the larger picture of the transatlantic defense community. For us, it's the complementarity between the European Union and NATO is clear. And for us, the transatlantic defense community is about working together as countries, about ensuring our security, about shouldering our responsibilities in the world. In other words, for us, NATO and the transatlantic defense community is being credible on security. And it's known that the larger picture of transatlantic defense is currently being dominated by the crisis, the events in Russia and Ukraine, which I would say reached its climax with the illegal annexation of Crimea in complete breach of international law. And I'm sure that we all are extremely closely following what is happening in the region and taking the appropriate measures. This Monday, the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the European Union will again have a meeting to examine the situation and maybe to decide upon other measures. But one thing is clear, that all these developments taking place in our neighborhood will have consequences, will have long-term consequences, and we are sure that one of the consequences, and a positive one, is an even more closer cooperation in security and defense matters between like-minded partners and friends in Europe, with Canada, and also beyond. So finally, I would say that this symposium, we hope to demonstrate that a strong common security and defense is a must in today's world. It's not a luxury, and here I quote one of my compatriots, the President Van Rompuy, who is the President of the European Council. It's not a luxury. Also, the strong common security and defense policy is part of a successful European foreign and security policy. And also, we are convinced that our comprehensive approach contributes significantly to peace and stability in the world without compromising on the rule of and the respect of international law and human rights. And last but not least, we hope that this symposium will demonstrate that European Union and Canada working together in these fields can and do make a difference. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful and fruitful symposium today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. Let us start with the first session of today. We're going to be discussing the outcomes of the European Council on Defense and the relationship with the upcoming NATO summit. And moderating the discussion will be a good friend of mine, Professor Sven Biskup, who's the Director of Europe in the World Program at the Royal Institute for International Relations. Those of you who don't know me, don't know him, I'm sure there's very few such people. Sven has been very much involved in stimulating debate on European security and including on Canada and EU relationship. I recall a very good seminar that you organized in Brussels with the help of Canadian delegation to the European Union. So I think it was a good forum to discuss the issues which we'll be covering today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you to take the floor, Sven.
And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very happy to be in Canada and to have the honor of chairing our first two panelists, whom I immediately invite to the podium as well, Maciej Popowski and Mr. James Bezan. Please want to join me. when I was got my instructions from the organizers, they said I should run this like a talk show. It seemed to me that most talk shows are designed rather to let the talk show host shine, and he will instrumentalize the guest in function of that. And tempted as I am, because I'm an academic and that comes with a certain vanity, I think you might be more interested in hearing from the speakers than from me. So let's not make it into a talk show. We come very well prepared, at least those of us who are part of the traveling circus of the European delegation, because we had the general repetition in this other capital, Washington. So now we're very well prepared for the real business. I've asked Mr. Popovsky and Mr. Bezan both to give a short introduction. Maybe I'll invent one or other follow-up question, but then we really want to engage with you. So first, Maciej Popovsky, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the European External Action Service. Please, Maciej.
Thank you, Sven, and it's good to be here. I'm very grateful for the initiative, and I'm sure it will be successful and to be continued in the future. Well, looking at the title of the panel, I would still like to start on with a more general reflection, because it's impossible nowadays to talk about security without mentioning the crisis in Ukraine. It's having an impact on everyone, on NATO, on the European Union, on the European countries, and on the transatlantic community. In a way, looking back, you could say that European Union, has been founded as a peace project, and its very foundation was the rejection of power politics. And still now in Europe, because of what's happened in Crimea and what's happening in Eastern Ukraine, we are faced with a comeback of power politics, unfortunately. So power is back, but you could also say so is defense and security policy. So defense considerations, defense policy is back with a vengeance. It features very prominently on the agenda of the North Atlantic Alliance, but also the European Union. The whole discourse about security and defense has changed fundamentally, and I think this debate has become much more serious than it was over the last few years. But of course, talking about security, common security defense policy, including its partnership dimension, to which I'll come back, it predates the current crisis. CSDP has already come of age. Depending on how you count, you could say it's at least 10 years old, because or 11 years old. It's 11 years ago that we launched our first ever military mission in former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And then we expanded to operate in many other places in the Balkans, in Asia, and in Africa. We've launched close to 30 civilian and military missions and operations. We have deployed 80,000 men and women, both civilian and military personnel. So the record is quite impressive. But the question is why? I mean, why? We could ask yourselves also as Canadians, why is Europe now, does Europe want to deal with security and defense? Why are we launching all these missions? Well, because we have set ourselves a certain level of ambition. We want to be a foreign policy player, and you cannot be a serious foreign policy player without a security and defense dimension of your policy. So we have established institutions, we have established procedures, and we have an established track record of working in other countries, but also working with others. The common security and defense policy is part of a broader package, and Marianne mentioned that that's the comprehensive approach. It's a second religion. I'm so sure Sven as a bishop would understand it very well. It is a second religion in Brussels. I mean, it's the way we want to run foreign policy. So security and defense policy is just part of a broader approach where we combine our diplomatic, defense and development instruments, and we try to do it in a coordinated fashion. We didn't invent it. It's been there, and it has different names in different in different organizations. UN, they have their policy of UN delivering as one. There is the 3D policy, which sounds very familiar in this country, I think, because Canada is also very much attached to this idea of combining defense, diplomacy, and development, and so on. So we call it comprehensive approach, but it is not that different from other policies. And it's important to understand because these missions serve a purpose. So when we go to Mali to train the Malian army, it is linked to the longer-term development of the country. We want to create modern security institutions that would guarantee sustainable development of a country. And the same, you will hear about it from Admiral Tarrant and others in another session on fighting piracy at the Horn of Africa. When we are chasing pirates at sea, but we know very well that the root causes of piracy are on land, so we need to engage in development programs. We need to create alternative sources of income for young Somalis who will no longer, hopefully, be tempted to become pirates because they could do something else with the lives. Last year, as Marianne mentioned, the European leaders, the heads of state and government, gathered in Brussels to discuss security and defense, which was quite unique because normally they deal with other kind of crisis management. They have to manage the crisis of the Eurozone. But this time, and it was a decision by the President Van Rompuy, they had a dedicated debate on security and defense. In a way, it was a byproduct of the Chicago summit. When the NATO decided to gather in Chicago, President Van Rompuy had this idea, well, we should have a dedicated discussion in Europe because we have a role to play. And that's exactly what happened. From a point of view of a bureaucrat, we thought it was very successful because they actually spent 3 hours discussing in details. You know, I still have some SMSs from my boss, the High Representative, asking me very precise questions from the meeting room about the funding of military operations. So it means it was a detailed discussion because the sense of urgency was there. The need to draw conclusions after these 10 or 11 years of CSDP and sort of chart out the direction of the future, where we want to go as Europeans. Well, the underlying assumption was first that the defense matters for us, Europeans, then that Europe should grow in its role as a security provider. For those 50 years after the Second World War, Europe has been a security consumer, but now we also want to give back. We want to be a security provider, we want to engage, we want to play a stabilizing role, and we want to take care of our own security, but also the security of our neighborhood, south and east, although I have to admit that the very concept of neighborhood has become a little bit extendable when you look where we operate now, for example, at the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel zone, but it's because the security threats are all interconnected and it's very difficult to draw a line where they end. So what we need, and these were the conclusions of our leaders' discussion, is a more effective CSDP. We have to do better. We have to be better at generating forces and funding our operations, at engaging with third countries and organizations who can contribute to our efforts. We need to develop European capabilities. I mean, if we want to be a serious player, we need capabilities, modern military capabilities, to be developed by a competitive and modern European defense industry. And that's why we have the European Defense Agency, and you will hear about it later today. So these clusters, effectiveness, capabilities, industry, have defined the agenda for the years to come. It was not a one-off. The European leaders are going to come back to this issue in June of 2015 and draw conclusions, assess progress, and that's a very good way of keeping security and defense on the agenda. Of course, the Ukraine crisis has put this whole debate and the ongoing work in a new context. So the sense of urgency is even bigger. The sense of Europe's responsibility for our own security and the security of our direct environment is even bigger. And we need to draw the right conclusions when it comes to Europe's defense and security posture, to the question of the level of defense spending. The defense budget have been on decline almost everywhere. There's only a handful, I think 4 members of NATO, 4 European members of NATO who are at the required level of 2% GDP spending on defense. This needs to change. We have to revert the trend, because otherwise we won't be either credible or really capable to act if needed. Finally, just a few words about the partnership dimension, which is what we are also going to discuss. I mean, how can we interact? How can we engage with others? We are not in it alone. CSDP has always been a very open project, and we've invited partners to contribute to our efforts from the outset. And Canada was one of the first to engage with us in Bosnia, and then in Congo DRC, in the UCOPS mission, the police training mission, Palestinian territories, and Afghanistan, and so on. This has become a policy within a policy. It is a cooperative project, so we are never alone, and we always invite partners. We need them. We need them because they bring in certain expertise. We need them to broaden our legitimacy when we go somewhere, and we go there with partners. And it's not only a European project, it's much broader than that, and that's what's happening quite a lot, for example, within the context of the African operations. But also partners benefit because when we look at the pattern of our engagement, you can see that there are certain emerging features. We have developed European specialties, like capacity building in third countries, training missions, advisory missions, both civilian and military. The training missions in Africa, it's something new. We were running 2 of them, one in Somalia, the other one in Mali, and by 2016 we will have trained 10,000 African soldiers, which is a very tangible contribution to lasting peace and security in this conflict countries. So because we do that as Europeans, we are building on our competitive edge. It's also interesting for partners to be able to contribute, whereas they are not always able to do it on their own nationally or in another framework, for example, in the NATO framework. Finally, on NATO, which is one of our strategic partners, we do a lot of things together. Politically, things are not always easy, but it doesn't prevent us from engaging with NATO on a daily basis, both at the headquarters level, and we have very good relations with our NATO colleagues, both the international staff and the military structures, and more importantly, even in the field. Whether it's off the coast of Somalia, Afghanistan, Kosovo, or Bosnia, we operate back to back. We very often rely on NATO for the security of our civilian operators, like in Afghanistan. And and sometimes we are also joined at the head, the Admiral Tarrant and his headquarters at Northwood, commanding both the EU anti-piracy operation Atalanta and the NATO anti-piracy operation Ocean Shield, which are perfectly coordinated and complementary, and we want to keep it that way. That's exactly how we would like to develop that. And finally, on our relation with Canada, I think, well, the scope is there. I mean, we have made a very good start already some time ago. I'm also encouraged by our bilateral contacts, both in Brussels and here, I mean, which are to be continued today and tomorrow. So I think we can do much more things together within the framework of European Common and Security Defense Policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Maciej. If I could ask you one question, perhaps a difficult one, that I often get myself when I'm asked to speak about European defense. So I really hope you have the answer, so next time I'll know what to say finally. I think for those who are less active members of this religion that you mentioned, probably the most tangible outcome of the European Council are the conclusions on capabilities. 4 projects mentioned, drones, cyber satellite communication, air-to-air refueling. But the question that I often get is, why are we confident that this time it will work? Because it's not the first time that in the EU or in NATO we announce big capability initiatives, but we rarely actually implement them. But why will it work this time?
Well, I'm just thinking whether I have an answer, but even if I do, it will come with a copyright fee. I think because of the sense of urgency, which was already there in December and has been reinforced by the recent developments. I mean, it's time to get serious about our commitment to defense, and a real commitment cannot work without serious work on capabilities. Well, the problem is that capability development are always long-term. So we can take a decision now to develop the technical conditions for a European drone by 2020, but it's still 2020, so for an outside observer, it's a long way off. But it's, I mean, it's important that the commitment is there, and that the European leaders remain interested and focused on the subject and exercise some sort of quality control. I mean, it sounds terribly bureaucratic, but the very fact that they decided to keep security and defense on the agenda is very telling, because it was unthinkable 3 or 4 years ago.
And it's good for us, the academics, because we know we'll have more to write about next June, a new European Council, to focus our agenda as well. Mr. Bezan, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be able to join everyone here, and we have so many people from the Diplomatic Corps and visitors from across the country and from across the ocean. You guys picked a good time to come to Ottawa. The weather is nice. We just finished having one of the coldest winters in the last 2 decades. Actually, in Manitoba, where I'm from, central Canada, we had the coldest and longest winter in 116 years. So it was brutal. Even into this morning in the newspaper, it's reporting that the city of Winnipeg is still having homes that have water lines freezing up to them. So the frost is still going down. So, you know, this is a great opportunity to bring greetings on behalf of Minister Nicholson, Minister of National Defense, but also talk about the relationship that we have with the European Union. We just finished concluding the most ambitious trade agreement that my generation has witnessed, with the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union. One that I'm looking forward to having that actually finally signed off on and brought into to existence. But I tell you, that really sets the tone for how we're going to go forward in our bilateral relationship between Canada and the European Union. Now, you know, we're talking about defense, and Canada, by nature, is an expeditionary military force. We're a huge country, 240,000 square kilometers of coastline. I should say 240,000 square kilometers coastline, 10 million square kilometers of territory. You know, most of our population is focused on the southern border with this huge, vast area. But you know, whether we're dealing with disasters, whether we're dealing with defense and security issues, whether it's Air Force, Navy, or Army, we have to be able to move. And we've always been a proud partner in so many different multilateral organizations. Every time Canada has gone out into a war effort, it has been part of a multinational force. You know, you look at our relationship that we have here in North America, and you want to talk about cooperation, all you have to do is look at NORAD and what we've been able to accomplish with the United States. First, from an aerospace standpoint, and now working with them on maritime surveillance as well. You know, we spent a lot of time in the National Defense Committee in the House of Commons looking at our relationships. So we're in the process looking at defense of North America right now. And Jack Harris, who's the vice chair of the committee, is here in the crowd, and one of my colleagues. You know, it is important that we take a look at these relationships, evaluate them from the political context, but also looking at how we move them forward into the future. Threats and situations are always changing. And so from a NORAD standpoint, if you want to look at how to make a relationship work, I think you look at the relationship between Canada and the United States and what we've been able to accomplish here. Now, of course, from a safety and security standpoint, it's more than just North America for us. It's about what happens in Europe. And we have been in Europe. Thousands and thousands of Canadians have fought and died in Europe, whether it was in World War I or World War II, Bosnia. Canadians have always gone to the call back to Europe. And now, deploying assets and personnel for the situation in Ukraine and our reinsurance package to NATO. So the global security environment continues to change, and we have to be prepared to deal with those issues. We have to be mobile, we have to be flexible, and we have to be capable. So readiness, training, interoperability are all things that we talk about amongst us as allies through our organizations, and working with like-minded nations, because I think all of us want to ensure that we have freedom, democracy, the respect for the rule of law, the respect for human rights. And whenever you see Canada and the European Union and other like-minded nations get together, it's often to fight for those values, to ensure that what we take for granted, all too often we're taking for granted what we have right here in our own home countries, are too often being ignored in other places, and atrocities are occurring. You know, we just finished celebrating this past weekend, the Battle of the Atlantic. Up until Afghanistan, that was the longest military mission that Canada has ever been deployed in. I know we have a number of people from the navies from around the world here today, and I know that maritime defense is a huge issue, and one that we have to continue to be engaged in. And transatlantic trade continues to be the forefront of our economic well-being. So we have to continue to be engaged on that front and ensure that that bond, that connectedness that we have in distributing our goods and wealth is something that we support, both from a North American context and within the European Union context. Now, Canada has been a founding member of NATO since 1949. It has been one of our most important multinational relationships that we have, both from a security and defense standpoint, as well as from a political standpoint. So it is important that we remain committed to the collective defense and security of all members of NATO. And what's happening today in Ukraine, what we're witnessing with, you know, this aggression, this provocative action coming from the Kremlin, is really putting our beliefs again to the test. We're at a situation where we haven't witnessed, you know, in over 60 years, that a country has actually started to redraw international boundaries in complete contravention to international law. And it is going to be inherent upon us on whether or not we allow this type of action to continue. So we have to make sure that our relationships are looking at our efficiencies, at our priorities, at our coordination. And so the cooperation between Canada and the European Union is core to how we move forward. Now, we do have a great organization that exists today to do that type of cooperation called NATO. And whatever we do through the European Union can't be duplicated. It has to be able to enhance, it has to be able to complement that relationship, so that whatever we're doing through other cooperative means actually builds upon the success that we already have within the NATO context. So, you know, we talk about defense spending. One thing that us as politicians are always seized with is how do you deal with budgets, how do you deal with problems around the world, and how do you deal with your constituents and the issues that they want to see addressed on a finite resource, and that's being the taxpayer's dollar. But that's where we come together. I know when we looked at the NATO strategic concept and the issue of smart defense. You know, how can we do more to, you know, really take advantage of each other's capabilities? And that's the beauty of the relationship, is where we make our investments, how do we augment each other's strengths, and where we have shortfalls, then lean on our friends and allies and neighbors to make up that difference. So our commitment to Europe has not changed one iota in the history of Canada. So many of us, you know, have our roots back to various European nations. So whether it's, you know, having to deal with situations like we see in the Balkans, whether it's the problems that were experienced back in Kosovo, whether it's cooperating like we did in Libya, you know, there is still work to be done. You know, tomorrow we're celebrating here in Ottawa the National Day of Honor, 12 years of Canadian and European involvement in Afghanistan. And we want to make sure that the 40,000 plus Canadians that serve there are properly thanked, and those that were left behind, that we honor their memory and their sacrifice. 158 Canadian soldiers, plus a diplomat, a couple of civilians. You know, it is important that we pay tribute to those individuals. And as I said before, the reinsurance measures that we're undertaking as a country with NATO, with our Navy, with our Army and our Air Force, is going to be critical to how things proceed here over the upcoming days. You know, we are sitting as witnesses and as players to where the future goes today. And the decisions and the actions that we take as they play out in relationship to the Russian Federation is going to be key to how the problem either escalates or disappears. And it is our responsibility to ensure that Central and Eastern Europe receive the support and help that they require. Now, I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions, and I think that it will be a great opportunity for us to build upon the great relationship that Canada and the European Union already enjoy, and I appreciate the invitation to participate.
Thank you. One question for you is, one of the factors that really did stir up the debate in Brussels is the shifting focus of US strategy to Asia, and it's often being talked about. And it's clear, and Macho also mentioned it, that there is a growing expectations that Europeans themselves take more initiative and leadership, certainly in their neighborhood, but that's a very big neighborhood and a very volatile neighborhood. But at the same time, we will talk later, General Vosolzoba, about a global European maritime security strategy. How is this seen in Canada? What are Canada's aspirations beyond Europe also? Can one also imagine Canada-EU cooperation, for example, in global maritime security?
And there's no question that Canada has engaged in more cooperative agreements on defense and security with Japan, with Brazil, of course, in the Caribbean. But I don't think it takes away one bit from our focus and our responsibilities to the agreements that we have in place in Europe today. So we still see us as a founding member of NATO, that is key to our overall operational mandate, and one that we'll continue to stay focused on.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open to you. I think I will stand up so that I have the overview. Maybe I can use this one. Because otherwise, the right-hand side is blocked here from my vision, and I don't want to exclude you from the discussion. Don't be afraid to be provocative. The topic may be religious, but nobody will be excommunicated today, except maybe me, because Marcia does know where I live, but he doesn't know where you live, so you're okay. Please, when you ask a question or give a short comment, be relatively concise, and if you could start by introducing yourself, who you are. Anybody who wants to break the ice, and please, sir. Microphone behind you.
Colin Robertson, Canadian Defence and Foreign Affairs Institute. My question to you both is, NATO is commitment, the target commitment is 2% of GDP. Most of the NATO members do not meet that, including Canada. We're, I think, about 1%, as my good friend Richard Cohen reminds me. How can you do less with less if we are to meet the commitments that you're describing, particularly as James Bazan, just what we're trying to do now, particularly in Europe, that we realize that force has returned.
Thank you. James, you want to pick that up first?
Certainly, and it is about making smart investment decisions, but I believe that as things are changing, then priorities within government will have to refocus as well. So, you know, right now at National Defense, we've been hearing from witnesses, and it has been suggested that we need to at least get our spending up to 1.7% within the Canadian context to meet the needs of the future, as well as the commitments that we've already put out there in you know, replacing fighter jets and rebuilding our Navy, continuing to equip our Army. So just with that and maintaining, you know, the current force that we have, numbers are going to have to start moving up again. But, you know, every country, or a majority of countries in the world, are struggling with this. The one thing that I like to point out is that while we have seen, you know, some reductions in spending amongst NATO allies, Russia has actually increased spending by 92%. Now, I know that they're coming from a very low base to start with, and still overall in the context of, you know, the Russian Federation versus spending from NATO members is still about half. But it is, I think, a concern that all of us have, and wanting to make sure that as NATO members, Colin, that we are making, I guess, informed decisions on where capabilities are being rebuilt, and trying to ensure that we don't make decisions that may actually long-term not complement each other.
Much does the EU's pooling and sharing initiative go anywhere to solve this? My friend Jo Kuhlmann always says you cannot pool a shortfall, you can only share the frustration.
Well, this is part of the answer, that we should be honest with ourselves. I mean, security comes with a price tag. I mean, it's not Wi-Fi. I mean, it has to be bought. And this is the moment to say it very openly, and that has to be repeated at the highest political level, and I'm sure it will be, both at the NATO World Summit and when our leaders meet again in June 2015. There is no quick fix. I mean, it's very difficult to raise your defense budget from 1% to 2%, for example, although it's happening already as we speak. I mean, immediately in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, Latvia and Lithuania have decided to reach the 2% threshold by 2020, starting from 0.8, 0.7. So that was quite a qualitative leap. But what we should do is, first of all, I mean, answering Sven's questions, to try how we can do things together. And that applies to us Europeans, because we still have 28 national budgets. So we spend those close to 200 billion euros annually on defense, but in a very, very fragmented way. So if we have more collaborative projects, we can pool and share the funding to acquire or develop capabilities that we could share again. It also requires a change in mindset. We need to move away a little bit from the traditional sovereignty thinking, this is mine, and don't touch this. And it can have a very negative effect on the defense planning, because if the member states don't talk to each other, and then they start, for example, reducing certain capabilities in an uncoordinated way, it can produce a disaster. So we should be more collaborative. And also, when we discuss about the capabilities of the future, I mean, the present and the future, these are high-end capabilities. And most of them are dual-use capabilities. So the technology is dual-use. So investing in them, it doesn't only mean pumping in money in the industrial military complex. It's much broader than that. That's where we are, as part of our agenda following the leaders' discussion. We are looking at the potential for synergies between the European research and development programs and the ongoing work on military capabilities.
Yeah, yes, please.
Thanks. Thank you. Steve Staples from the Rito Institute. Mr. Bazana, just a question. You mentioned NORAD in your remarks and the European Union, and one of the common factors there is missile defense. The European phased adaptive approach, the European version of missile defense, and of course the ground-based missile defense system still here in North America. And I did note that last night Global TV ran a piece asking a question whether this Conservative government was looking at Canada's role in missile defense. I noticed both the Defense Committee and the Senate Defense Committee are examining this question, in fact, today. So I just wondered is the Conservative government taking another look at missile defense, either in North America or Europe?
Not to my knowledge, actually. We definitely through committee talking about defense in North America, and the Senate Committee has been holding their own hearings, and BMD has come up in the discussion, and but most of that has been coming forth from witnesses. I know Colin's going to be at committee today, but there is definitely people out there that are in favor of it. I guess the question is when we were at NORAD in Colorado Springs, that if a threat ever presented itself, that Canadians that are sitting in the room in Colorado Springs are essentially silenced as to whether or not any missile defense goes into play if an aggressive action was taken against North America, and very well could be coming through Canadian airspace. And when you look at the capabilities of some of these countries that have some ballistic missile in their arsenal or in the process of developing it, you kind of question whether or not how accurate they're going to be in their launch. And it could very well be that Canada might be the target itself, and yet we won't have a say. So one of the things that we're hearing from witnesses is that, as a mature nation, should we be sitting on the sidelines or should we be participating in those discussions if and when they happen? But that's something that committees will look at and make recommendations to government at the end of the day.
Thanks so much.
Please.
Georges Paquet, former Canadian diplomat. The European Union has a seat in the at the General Assembly of the United Nations. Is anybody thinking of European Union having closer relations with NATO, formal relations, eventually a seat in NATO? Thank you.
To excommunication now anyway, I feel. But Maciej, please.
Well, it sounds a bit heretic indeed. We are not talking about a formal relationship in the sense of a European seat at NATO, and I'm not sure it would make sense. But what we need is a much closer relationship, organization to organization, which, as I tried to explain, it's already ongoing, although there are certain political obstacles still to be overcome between both organizations. In particular, the issue between Cyprus and Turkey. I mean, this process is ongoing, and we very much hope that the problem will be resolved because it would facilitate things. I mean, we could, for example, have a formal agreement on the exchange of classified information, which is very important for the operational purposes. So we are looking at things like that. But when it comes to the cross-representation at the table, something that you mentioned, as a matter of fact, it's already happening. The High Representative Cathy Ashton is invited to each and every NATO ministerial meeting, defense and foreign ministers, and the NATO Secretary General is also attending all EU defense ministers meetings meetings, and this is an established practice, and it's going. I mean, it's working very well, also in terms of political visibility. As I have to replace the High Representative quite often at these meetings, I get a lot of visibility myself because we always seated between NATO SG and the US Secretary of Defense. So I'm usually on the news without asking for it.
Do you want to comment on this topic? Or, certainly as an academia, I can also testify that, you know, this used to be one of the cottage industries of academia, but now whenever we and my colleagues interview officials, everybody always says that relations are actually not just cordial, but very productive at the various levels between the two. Sir, you had a request for the floor.
Richard Cohen. I'd like to respond to your request to be provocative. And to follow on from Stephen Staples' question about ballistic missile defense for you, James, although I think probably Stephen and I are looking at it from slightly different perspectives. Is Canada, in view of what's been happening in the last couple of months, looking at not only ballistic missile defense, which to me is our refusal to participate is, I think you'll agree, a purely political issue. It's not a technical issue, it's not a military issue, it's not a strategic issue. All those things are, I think, pretty obvious that we should be participating. Canada has taken, from my point of view, pretty irrational position in NATO on ballistic missile defense, specifically stating that we, Canada, are not part of the NATO declaration on missile defense. But also, as you know, we've withdrawn from the Allied Ground Surveillance System, AGS. We've withdrawn almost completely now from AWACS. And it's, I think, ironic that there's still some Canadian airmen there who are kind of being touted as heroes with the AWACS force before they finally withdraw. It seems to me the time has come for us to revisit those decisions, both as a practical measure and also a demonstration of our commitment to NATO and transatlantic partnership. So be very interested to hear your comments on that, James.
Thanks, Richard. And you know, I think on your first point, you know, there's no question that there are people that want to see Canada participate in ballistic missile defense within a North American context, and we know that things are progressing as well from within Europe. But you know, the government hasn't made any decisions, and essentially, Parliament at both the House and the Senate is studying these issues, and I think that they'll wait and see what comes out of those studies and reports back and recommendations made by those committees. So I think that's where you know that will proceed along those lines. That it's going to be again a political decision, and if it becomes difficult from the political side, I don't see you know, if there isn't any, I guess, collaboration on how we move forward, then I think we'll be looking at the status quo. On the standpoint of responsibilities within NATO, things have changed. There's no question of it, and we do have to revisit, in my personal opinion, of you know, AWACS and our Allied Ground Land Force and how we move forward. And so we have made some commitments. We do already have our CF-18s over there. We have a squadron, ground support personnel. We have placed a platoon in Poland with the Americans and doing some training right now, but that will probably be enhanced to a longer deployment at a company strength. So, and of course we have the Regina joining the NATO Standing Maritime Force. So, you know, I think that unless things de-escalate, the Canadian commitment to NATO will be growing, and of course there is a cost tied to that.
Question from the other side of the floor.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm Jack Harris, the opposition critic for defense here in Canada. If I may move away from the BMD debate, since I don't know if this is the forum for that, but there are certainly other forums in the House of Commons and other places domestically. But I want to ask Mr. Popowski the question, we have NATO as the primary form of cooperation between Canada and Europe, the transatlantic bond, et cetera, on the defense side, and certainly the political dimensions as well. Looking at your title here, I wonder if you could go a little further in terms of what kind of cooperation would the EU be expecting with Canada on the defense and security side. Are we talking about bilateral recognition of the EU as a foreign policy guide for Europe? Are we talking about policy primarily, or is there an understanding or expectation that there be another layer of cooperation on the military side as well? And I'd like to hear your comments, and James, if you have anything to say about that, would be great.
Thank you very much. Sure. We'll talk about the political relationship, but also, and increasingly so, a very operational one. When the CSDP is an expeditionary policy. So that's the very basic difference between EU and NATO, that EU is not a military alliance. So we are not dealing with common defense. So when we talk about our partnership, our relationship with any other third country organization, be it NATO, United Nations, or Canada, or Norway, or Turkey, then we really speak about engagement out there, not in Europe, but in other theaters where we operate. And as I said, it started back in 2003, and we've been enlarging this network of relationship over the last years. So we normally, whenever we start a new civilian mission or a military operation, we always go to our member states and ask the question, are we ready to invite partners? I mean, the answer is yes, in principle. We just need to decide which partners. With many of them, we have the so-called framework participation agreements, just setting the rules for their participation in a given mission, which facilitate things. So then they just have to say yes or no. Most of these contributions are relatively limited, specialized. Sometimes these are in-kind contributions, like the latest contribution by Canada to our training mission in Mali, EUTM Mali, training the Malian army, a financial contribution of $1 million Canadian to set up as a management system for the chain of payments in the Malian army. Well, very much appreciated. I mean, it's not exactly, it's not a classical military contribution, but something that was badly needed in that given context. That's exactly the kind of things we would like to develop. And the demand for CSDP is growing. When you looked at, over the last few years, we've launched several missions, most of them in Africa. And Africa, in a natural way, has become a center of gravity of our operational engagement. And that creates a lot of opportunities for partnerships. We need to complement it with more sort of political dialogue, exchanges at the political and strategic level. And we've been working on that with the Canadian mission in Brussels. I'm also having a number of bilateral meetings today to see how we could have a more regular political dialogue and security and defense matters that would come on top of all our very intense exchanges on trade issues or some regional questions.
Yeah, and I think from a Canadian context, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's about making sure that we aren't duplicating efforts that already exist and connections that we have within NATO. But as is being suggested, that the African nations situation that we're seeing today in Nigeria and the Central African Republic and some of the hotspots through that area, there is roles there for Canada. There's no doubt where we can help. And policing, the RCMP have been involved in some joint collaboration with the European Union already, and on the side of training. Definitely from support logistically and providing expertise in the field or something that we can deliver as well. So there is this opportunity to work together on some of these missions, and I think that as we formalize and develop the relationship, it'll be, I think, to the benefit of both players.
Thank you. Any further questions? Oh, please.
Thank you. A question on the same subject that Mr. Harris raised. We've had questions about ballistic missile defense and the defense of North America. And we've had, I think Sven talked about the issue of interest in the Pacific, and Mr. Bezan answered that question. It's clear that Canada has had long-standing security and defense interests with Europe and in Europe. I mean, the 20th century we were involved in 2 world wars and the Cold War. And in the Cold War we forget just how many troops were permanently stationed in Europe at what cost to the Canadian taxpayer. Clearly Europe has not got over its issues. And the Ukraine crisis and the Crimea crisis, we're tending to forget about that, suggests that there's a very dangerous situation brewing there. That would suggest that Canada has some interest, some continuing interest in cooperation with Europe on security and defense issues. And our institution of choice for a very long time for cooperation with Europe on security and defense issues has been NATO, because we're in NATO, and therefore we have a role in participating in NATO decision-making. I spent a long time in the Department of Foreign Affairs in the international security field, and I'm confused as to why at this stage people might think that given Canada's interest in North America, Canada's security interest in the Pacific, our current engagement through NATO with Europe, that we should be spending any time, effort, or money trying to forge relationships with the European Union in this particular field. Answer, would be happy to get your comments on that.
Sure. Well, this is all about complementarity. I'm trying to explain that we, within the framework of CSDP, we are doing things that NATO is not willing and sometimes not capable of doing. One huge area is civilian CSDP missions, where Europe is one of the leading market providers. You know, the police missions, training, advisory in places like Mali, Niger, or Palestinian territories and Afghanistan. Canada has been participating in this police mission in Afghanistan for quite some years, and very successfully so. So there is certainly no duplication. The whole engagement in Africa, again, where the center of gravity of our activities is, well, no, Africa is not an isolated European problem. It's a global responsibility. So when we engage there with other partners, we do it as representatives of international communities. Again, it's for each and every country to decide whether or not this country would like to engage with us or not. But we're certainly ready to offer that. So it's not a question of choice, because Canada's interest at NATO is different, because NATO is a defense alliance that is now, in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, going back to its core functions, or refocusing on its core function, which is collective defense and deterrence, which is certainly not a core function of the European Union.
I think that there is a difference from NATO versus the European Union to what's happening right now in Ukraine. You know, the NATO alliance in Article 5 only applies to member states. So, you know, former Soviet states like Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Latvia, you know, they're in a unique position now that they fall under Article 5, and Canada and our allies are there to defend. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, all that are really anxious and have internal conflict now because of the situation with the aggressive behavior of the Russian Federation, aren't part of NATO. We all know that. However, they do have very close relationships with the European Union, and there is bilaterals there. And because of that, I think the European Union has a role to play in trying to secure their situations. So I think there is a difference, but at the same time, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There is a long-time alliance that has worked very successfully. It's definitely becoming back to its basics with everything that's happening. It's no longer an issue that we haven't seen in 60 years, where we're dealing with NATO going out into other areas of the world geographically than within the NATO alliance. But all of a sudden, we do have a conflict right within our borders. 9/11 being the exception, of course.
Pulpit anyway. Certainly, talking of religions, the NATO religion is a very vibrant one as well, and I participated in the seminar of Allied Command Transformation preparing the NATO summit in Paris just about a month ago. And one congregates to profess one's beliefs in the Holy Alliance, and because it is holy, there is not that much tolerance for heretics. So I went there with a little trepidation because most of my NATO friends regard me as Mr. EU. And I was very surprised to hear that all the heretical thoughts that I had planned to voice there, my thunder was stolen by all the senior Americans present there. And so by way of wrapping up, what I think is really a growing force in the transatlantic defense community is probably pragmatism, forced by shrinking budgets, forced by the fact that the focus of the number one, the biggest ally in the alliance, United States, is more divided than it was before, and forced by the urgency of Ukraine. It seems to me that many people on both sides of the Atlantic say, well, what we need is solutions. And what label is put on those solutions is probably less crucial as long as they are indeed solutions. And perhaps what we see is that we have a very complex security architecture in which we have the states, both sides of the Atlantic, we have NATO, and we have the European Union. And actually, none of these three can gather all the instruments, the functions, and the budgets to ensure the security that we need. And that's so you need all three to cooperate together to deliver what is necessary. And if, because of experience, because of other factors, a certain function turns out now to be better exercised by one part of its architecture than another one, and there's a shifting within the architecture, perhaps we shouldn't be too afraid about it. And definitely what I took from the ACT seminar is that most people say, well, when it comes to increasing European capabilities, as Marche said, that it's a European problem that can only be solved by European cooperation, and it's probably perhaps not more easy, but less difficult if Europeans just do that among themselves through the CSDP with the help of the Commission and the European Defence Agency, etc., as long as that gets us the extra capabilities that we want, which will still be available both for NATO operations, EU, the United Nations, national operations, and so on. So it seems to me that as a result, pragmatism is really on the rise, and we get over the theological debates. And the pragmatists on both sides of the Atlantic are engaging in very constructive. Now, of course, I say the pragmatists support us, but to quote Adlai Stevenson, he once said when he was running for the presidency of the United States, and someone told him, Mr. Stevenson, all intelligent Americans will vote for you. And he said, yeah, that I know, but the problem is I need a majority. So the pragmatists are with us. The question is, are they constituting the majority yet? I have a feeling we're getting close, and if we focus on solutions, we can advance this. Gentlemen, let me thank both of you for your frank replies to the indeed provocative questions. Let me thank all of you in the audience for kicking us off in that manner and for setting a precedent from which it is now impossible to deviate in the next session, to which I look forward. But first, we're entitled to a coffee break, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you again, gentlemen.
As Sven said, there's a coffee break. We invite you to, and it takes place in that space over there. And we kindly ask you to come back in half an hour. Thank you.